Now, there's lots and lots of advice available, isn't there, on how we should learn piano. But today I'd like to talk to you about 3 very popular pieces of advice that I've stopped routinely following. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Now, when I first returned to piano seriously, so probably back in 2015, I did what I guess most of us do and got on YouTube to see what I could discover. And one of the most popular pieces of advice there was all about practicing things hands separately. And when I try to remember back to my teenage years, I don't remember ever really doing this. And I thought to myself, maybe that's why I hit the wall and couldn't actually improve beyond a certain point. And then I also read Chuan-Si Chang's book, The Fundamentals of Piano Practice, and his view was that all piano technique is acquired hands separately and not hands together. Indeed, he even goes as far as to say there's no real point in practicing scales hands together. So I decided that I should actually stop jumping straight into hands together practice for anything that I was going to find a little tricky, and therefore I diligently practiced my new pieces hands separately, and I probably did this for a few years. However, some years later, I was reading Neuhaus's book, The Art of Piano Playing, and he has a very different view of the world. Now, if you're not familiar with Neuhaus, he was a very famous Russian teacher who taught everybody from, in his words, the most musically deficient to the genius. So he taught Gilels and Richter, for example. In his words, his book, The Art of Piano Playing, is aimed at the average piano student and the average piano teacher. And it tries to summarize everything he thinks he's learned about piano pedagogy over the years. Now, Neuhaus likens hands-separate practice to some kind of emergency exit. So something that we should only use in extremis when all else fails, but not something that we should routinely go to. Now, when I thought about this, I had to sort of admit to myself that mastering each hand separately didn't really seem to help me when putting the two together. And in fact, sometimes it almost felt like completely starting over. And I did a little further research and I found out that there does appear to be some neurological evidence that suggests that in actual fact, practicing hands separately is probably counterproductive. I therefore decided that I would stop practicing hands separately as a routine way of starting a new piece. However, as I pointed out in the video about my favourite practice tips, one of the key things about any practice technique is that it makes something simpler for us. So it takes something that we'd probably find impossible to practice and turns it into something that we can practice. And of course, practicing one hand at a time is the ultimate simplification, I guess. So what I'll do instead is, rather than practice hands separately, I'll probably simplify one or both of the hands so that initially I'm practicing something that is still simpler. So I'm still practicing both hands together, but with slightly less notes. Now, a second piece of very prevalent internet advice was all about the importance of absolutely mastering everything to perfection. And I've even seen people go as far as to say, if you can't play something 3 times through without any errors, with your eyes closed, then you still haven't mastered the piece. Now again, this is something that as a teenager I never really bothered to do. I always thought, if it gets to a certain point where it sounds good enough, it'll do. After all, most of my friends wouldn't know if it was perfect or not anyway. So again, I thought perhaps this is another reason why I was failing to improve all those years ago, is that I actually didn't put in enough work to get something perfect. However, I had to realize too that we do face this idea of diminishing returns, where we're putting in an awful lot of work, but we're seeing very little progress as a result of that work. I'm a keen viewer of Josh Wright Piano TV, and he released a very interesting video that he called Repertoire Museums. And in this video, he suggested that especially we adults can quite often have a tendency to obsess with a piece and try keep pushing and pushing for perfection, rather than simply moving on and learning something else. After all, as he said, there's nothing wrong with putting something to one side for a while and then coming back to it later. Again, I had a little think about this and I thought, on balance, he's probably right. So almost immediately, I sort of put aside all of these pieces I'd been working on for ages and just chose some new things to learn. And for the most part, I actually forced myself not to go near them for 6 months and sometimes for longer than that. Now, interestingly, when I came back to them, not only did I find I could get them back to the level that they were relatively quickly, I also found that I was able to make much faster progress with them. Now, I think this is probably due to a couple of things, really. The first thing is, I think when we stick with something for too long, we sort of can't see the wood for the trees, and we end up we're practicing and practicing, but we don't really know how to work out what it is we're doing wrong that's stopping us from progressing. And of course, after 6 months or 12 months of regular practice, then I'd like to think that we become better pianists. And so when we pick these pieces up again, we've got new skills and new knowledge that we can apply as we try to progress with them. So now I'll definitely avoid working on something for too long. And in fact, what I'll actually do generally is set myself a time box. Now this might be a certain number of days that I'll practice something, a certain number of sessions, a certain number of hours, whatever it may be. But once I reach that time box, I just discipline myself to put the piece to one side, no matter where I got to with it, and then make notes on how I'm going to come back to it later. Now, finally, what I'd like to talk about is this wisdom around never practicing wrong notes. Now, some would have us believe that we're sort of like some kind of computer, that whatever we do, we sort of record it internally, and therefore, if we play a wrong note in our practice, we'll record that wrong note and it will keep coming back. And this is why, of course, they'll then say we should practice in a way that we don't make any mistakes. Now, to do this, we might be advised to slow something down to the point that we never make a mistake. We might even be advised to not only slow it down, but practice it one hand at a time so we can do it without making any mistakes. And of course, this makes perfect sense, doesn't it? If we don't practice wrong notes, then theoretically, we won't play wrong notes. However, I read a very interesting book by William Westley called The Perfect Wrong Note, and he has a slightly different view of the world. The way he looks at wrong notes is that they come in two main categories. We have an honest mistake and a careless mistake. What he in fact suggests is that quite often piano practice can be a little like target practice. And when we first start with something, we should probably reasonably expect to miss the target more often than we hit it. And in fact, it's the process of missing the target that helps us to improve our aim, so to speak. So on this principle, we should practice in ways that allow us to make mistakes so we can learn from the mistakes that we've made. However, and this is a very important aspect of it, not all mistakes are good. And where the mistakes are not good is where they're what he calls careless mistakes. So they're mistakes we make without really thinking about them, without trying to correct them, without trying to work out what it is that caused us to make the mistake in the first place. And I guess the way to think about it is that if we're in a situation where we just keep playing something wrong, but think if I repeat it often enough, eventually it'll come good, then that probably won't work for us. So now I've stopped worrying about wrong notes and feeling guilty when I play them. However, that's not to say that I allow myself to practice in a sloppy manner. I think the key to this is that we try to treat each wrong note as an opportunity to learn the right one. Now, if you'd like to know about the practice techniques that I do find the most helpful, then the video I've linked here for you goes into just those things. And if you're not already, please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit the little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.